Go again. This is a continuation of the talk about origins, understanding profound space, or space that you make profound because you notice it. How that ends up as design, as architecture, as participation, as perceiving it. This is a thing I prepared with Anne McCoy for developing ways of teaching art history through virtual reality at Yale, between departments, trying to seek kind of a common space. This was about 4 or 5 years ago, which eventually, with the birth of spatial I/O, made this a little obsolete, because we were going to use Unity engine and to make all of this, and eventually it just you have pretty well plug and play items through spatial cosmologies. I have an idea of cosmologies explaining the origins. Astronomy, leading cosmologies is the Big Bang Theory. This is scientific, mathematical, not entirely proven. Recently, there are discoveries in physics that the universe should be slowing down when, in fact, it's speeding up. To paraphrase that, it started with a huge explosion. Ancient cultures all had models of a universe based on their creation myths, explaining their origin and place in the world, the space, our space, the black holes. Our Western Judeo-Christian ideas, the heavens, the reality was created in 7 days. Creation of light from darkness created heavens, earth, land, and sea, sun, moon, stars, sea creatures, fish, birds, mankind, and the beasts of the earth. Sanctified the seventh day as the Sabbath, the day of rest. So these are modalities. Babylonian upright central line is the polar axis, the axis mundi, traveling through, relating nature and the divine with the human, penetrating all three realms. We have that dichotomy of the above, the upper world, the sky, and the below, the underworld. Perhaps this is sort of relating to the mystery of death, the mystery of toil, as we saw in that documentary film, that even death itself, or especially death, can be tweaked, approached, dealt with technology, uploading your memories, creating bodies that live longer. All of these cosmologies are, as we saw in Gebser, the ever-present origin is still there, but extends into our reality. What sort of realities, profound spaces, are you creating on the stage, on the performance venue, in the club, in the film, in the game, in the installation? What are you attempting to mimic? Life can spring from the depths of the sea or the core of the earth. Emergence myth is where the creation comes from below. This is the Navajo cosmos springing from below. Reflected in their sand paintings. The Dain, the Navajo Hogan completes a dome-type structure, where the idea of each society reflecting with its cosmologies, with its modalities, it somehow reflects that into the architectural settings. This is obvious, especially in America, where the post-war, the car became the two things, both the liberating device and the device of creative destruction. It alleviated or cut down, it gave as an object a detachable room to these basically these Cape Cod ideal houses from New England spread across America in the form of simple two-bedroom Cape Cod, that the car was the mutable factor. The car was the removable room that expressed and embodied two things. It was a machine of great potential, great utility, yet it was a machine of great creative destruction and potlatch, that you sort of wasted your money, creative destruction, and certainly with the pollution it created is an object of waste as much as it is an object of use. The mythos, the modality mythos of the car attends the kind of American cosmology of potential mobility, potential alleviation of loneliness, as we saw with the Model T. The Dreamtime is an imaginal construct that exists today. So here we have the spike through the axis mundi. We have the human world, our world, as participants, as students, as people taking this class to try to understand what is so special that would, should happen in a designated space, and why would we go pay money to see things like this. And then there's the human world, the physical world, which is a world of nature, and then the sacred world, kind of a separate realm hanging over these two realms. We see these in Dreamtime, etchings in stones, cave paintings, Aboriginal Australian paintings, the Apache maiden ceremonies where the girl dances in an arbor, which represents the days of creation, of 4 days ceremony. In many cultures, the creation myth is danced and performed at puberty. Rites of passage, the ability to replicate the self in adolescence, the kicking in of hormones at that era, at that time, and allowing you to experience this transition is part of societies around the world. And here are these dances. For the Pueblo Indians, it's a hole in the underground. Many societies have an attention to where the sun is, grounded in the creation myths. Hindu fire priests attending to fires. Egyptian creation myths, the Ben or sacred mound comes up from the depth. All architecture represents this original stamp of creation. The leaf, papyrus leaf, Edfu temple, a stone. And so we have a little of taste of what it means to be around, and to perhaps formulate something for this final space in a spatial I/O. And here's just some background settings, painted, digitally painted, of urbanscapes, creating fantastic landscapes, nightmares, so forth. Here's the structure we worked out to indicate, use this kind of as a pedagogical tool, a teaching tool. We have the YouTube research, the CAD study, the sketch study, the story study, the historical study. All these are added into this space, and with this, we're placing it inside the VR space, with these archetypal things: open topography, mountain, sea, forest, desert, nature, cosmological map, upper world, axis, moon, heaven axis, the dome, the sphere, the void, the great burial trench, the world, journey, navigation, travel, the world as void, suffered but didn't struggle. This is the great burial trench. The great burial trench, the processional, the architectural mass, the urban gates and walls, the urban maze. Again, what we're aiming for in this lecture is an idea of an empty space, entering into a space, such as a suburban cul-de-sac in one of the New York suburbs, and trying to understand why it was made, how it is made, how it renders value to people, and then try and see the resonance in history of these spaces. So this is the kind of methodology that we had in placing these things in a landscape. And then the objectives interceded with the tools to create this. Furthermore, this is a little dialogue on how you design dreams, how you make these spaces now using the tools of digital painting, CAD rendering, how you make costumes, how photography and design and painting have now blended together. So we have these fantastical landscapes still obeying more or less the rules, the laws of composition. The red against the bluish scents, this point of line, mystery. This is Lequesne, a great 200-year-old French painter, engraver of architecture and figures. This is Piranesi, who created all these prison fantasies. And these are some modern media artists creating the hybrid blends between photography and painting. And this leads to designing dreams. This is a working helicopter that takes on passengers, a scenic backdrop of games, more of games. This artist has all these large suspended works overhead, more costumes, more fantastical landscapes, more urbanscapes as we enter into a realm, a world where up to 70% or more of the world's population will live In cities, agriculture, processed agriculture is relatively inexpensive now. It is done with tractors and automation. This means that people are trying their fate in cities. There will be certain disruptions over this, but still the fantastical aspect of cities is what is portrayed in many of these scenographic movies, game type structures. Here's a favorite little tiny house of mine. It folds, bedroom folds open, and this kind of greenhouse thing folds and envelops this bedroom. Yeah, examining objects in CAD, making the objects showing up, and again expressing kind of nightmare environments in terms of their kind of an urban romance. Here's back to, no, that's not Piranesi, but it looks like Piranesi, a modern attempt at a Piranesi. All of this has been inhabiting certainly recent films since the early 80s, as CAD and certain things have changed the whole landscape. Again, brilliant open portals to worlds, but maintain kind of a nightmare landscape. Where is the sacred in these? The sacred tower, the Tower of Babel. The higher it goes, the more people cannot understand each other. What cultures are you from that you are bringing your sense of space into this assignment, these projects? What is your background in terms of space? So all of these features are adding up to a kind of a dystopic nightmare look, but this idea of the future gives us kind of notions of what can be done, what can we do in terms of DIY, like this pair of jets, underwater jets you wear to propel yourself across underwater. Hybrids now between the digital and the analog, CAD and its final representation, the sort of similarities between installations and what we see in movies and so forth. What new shapes can lead us to product designs and new ways of altering materials of that 50s car, that detachable suburban room, that was both useful, filled with potential, but also destructive in terms of anteing up in the poker game to those you work with that you've bought the most expensive car you could possibly do at your budget. And then I go to the Evolo skyscraper competition, and we look at examples from 100 years ago, 1911, I think this was, some visions of the future, vehicles of the future. What will they be? Some people think they'll be 3D printed. Some people think there will be all electric, even though that's to have electric vehicles is difficult. These were proposed, these floating cities in Tokyo Harbor, I think it is. This is interesting, but it also takes on a dystopic aspect to it, kind of future, past retro, taking older Asia and then placing it into modern Tokyo, modern Seoul, modern Shanghai. And all of these images inhabit realms we think about in terms of the future. how will it be convenient? How will we find that balance between George Orwell and Huxley, Brave New World? Further designs, ideas, dwellings, habitats. How will people live? How are we considering people living? Will we implode into our own sense of entertainment, gaming, so forth? This is a lecture on just the saturation that we are exposed to. Here's a campsite from the 60s, I think it is. Simplicity. Why do we go to the archetypal wilderness to wipe the slate clean, as it were, to reconnect with nature, perhaps the sacred, and so forth. That's it for this one. Cosmologies. In the last lecture, I opened it up to creating these spaces in SketchUp. We're trying to make these things inhabit our spaces in spatial I/O, which books like this, where do we go to perceive space? Where do we go to appreciate space? Where do we go to enhance space? This Pueblo Chinese Mayan view of these quadrant worlds is great similarities over vast spaces. I'm into creating these temporary architectural performance structures spread out, and making studies of the problem of the cube, volume and mass, this kind of sacred tension between volume and mass can be continually worked out. So proceeding along on all these things Jungian, such as the notion, we talked about this from a lecture by a couple Stony Brook professors on the coercion theory of value, that it takes 7 or 8 different people, usually men, to put down one individual who's gone rogue, and that person has projectiles. This is not the idea of using projectiles in the face, or in the necessity for control, is one of the greatest new definition of this coercion theory of society, in that with the Homo sapien taking on projectile spears, sling spears, things like that, it took more individuals to overcome one individual who would go contrary to the society. So in one of the assignments, wanted it for the final assignment, doing a container car performance space in spatial I/O. We're trying to work that sequence out, proceeding along. And trying to understand how and what is the relationship of your life to space, and so forth. We can deal with where you came from, urban spaces. We've delved into this idea of Carl Jung, man and his symbols, which deals with different archetypal objects, things, Egyptians, objects, but also, in this case, modern painting, Rorschach, individuals trying to call up the sacred in the face of human society, in the face of nature, which is physical, material processes. What are they doing to try to continue building up the need for the so-called sacred space, the event space? In some senses, the modern spectacle, this is the conversion of Saul, St. Paul, a painting in out of the early Roman realist tradition, and Hieronymus Bosch. That we look to artists and painters to sort of make sense, or to make visible what this sacred relationship had been or will be between humans and nature. Moving along, I wanted to maybe round the corner. There's this Evolo exercise. It's a Italian design magazine, but every year they have their contest. You can enter into the designing a skyscraper contest. And this is part lecture on that, because it also resonates on a Jungian level and so forth. There was an idea, we're talking about spaces, where we live, how we see things. This is in the EPUB. Sorry, it's going to come over here. With the big, smelly cities and their core industries and the pollution, there was an idea that both working class and upper class people needed to return to the garden. This is the first English suburbs before the American suburbs, and it had that notion on the belts. We talk about marbleizing towns in my urbanism class, that we needed proximity to nature, that there still continued we needed natural settings to resonate with us. And so this is part of that. Here's some examples of the Evolo skyscraper competition. Most of this is done in CAD and then repainted over in things like Photoshop and so forth. So they take on a very detailed, very wonderful sensibility to them in terms of fantasy worlds, in terms of these Jungian sacred places. The Ready Player One, I read the book. I didn't like the film at all. Kind of boring about this notion of different levels of reality, and the realities we put young people through suffered in that it wasn't as philosophically taught as the book. Can our architects, can our urban planners, can our designers create the sacred space again? This might be possible. This is an Evolo skyscraper, presumably on the skyline of New York. Again, there's that gut punch. It's beautiful. It's incredible. It's wonderful. And here's Ebenezer Howard and placing his garden cities outside of the center city. And that nature, return to gardening, return to all of this sort of reinforces a necessity for a return back to the archetypes of nature. Certainly in movies like Mad Max, the last one, there's a great deal of hybrid filtered film work with CG and coloration and enhancing and so forth that portrays a dystopic world. And back to the Evolo skyscrapers, proposed things that people offer up and get, probably architectural students, they get shown in their book. To me, they again speak of, as design objects, they speak of this sacred space again. Towers. The archetype of the tower implies hierarchy, implies distance, abstraction, and through the Tower of Babel, it implies the inability to understand language anymore. These are attempts at, here's a bunch of traditional Chinese houses stacked up. It's an attempt to have these dwellings resonate again with a modern audience, in the sense that these are skyscraper competitions, and these are fantastical, almost return back to sacred spaces. There's nothing like walking through the jungles of the Yucatan and Central America and seeing what looks to be like a rather large hill encrusted with jungle foliage, and have the tour guide say that is a yet to be excavated temple. The temples of Uxmal are incredible. The finesse with which the Mayans laid down their cities in squares, grids, and so forth was incredible. Again, it strikes you with people in touch with the resonance of the sacred and manifesting these in spaces. These are select movies. The Holy Mountain by Alejandro Jodorowsky, which he's a great Chilean surrealist movie maker of this late 60s, early 70s. The films are, especially this exploding toad part, is just a sequence of a narrative craziness. These are all the movies inspired by Carl Jung. Dark City is perhaps one of the more famous ones, done way back in the mid-90s, I think, early 90s. And again, these attempts in Evolo to create structures, designs, gigantic, unbuildable, because who's going to finance them? But these structures are to resonate with our inner subconscious selves, trying to perceive meaning in landscapes that our ancestors knew and somehow have been translated to us in our yet to be found DNA on cities. The urbanization gene, if they thought they had located it, but what makes us perceive certain aspects of our landscape now in a very society's becoming very impoverished in terms of perceiving landscapes, or at least wiping a slate clean. But what do we have left in terms of creating a blank slate and getting back to having an excitement even about a dystopic space? So Evolo does this, and I'm a big fan of this, creating new structures that they're not really meant to be bought and sold as sculptures, but they're temporary architecture that are meant to resonate with a population. Digital and parametric architecture, we went from parametric, small-scale parametric design up to the larger stuff. This was the German expressionist architect, I forget his name, and certain pieces of Zaha Hadid in this. Let's wrap it up with just a talk about what skyscrapers mean. Buildings across towers. Towers represent a lot, the vantage point, what it took to build them, the notion of fragility, how they can be knocked over. Towers are part of this psychic landscape in addition to just physical engineering structures. So we see an obelisk or tower establish the point on the ground and makes that point on the ground visible. So again, it relates to this axis mundi, but it expands that concept of use. A column generates a field around itself and interacts with the space. The obelisk at St. Peter's is case in point, complete for visual symmetry. We can position these verticals to create compositions. The obelisk, the tower, Campidoglio, in the Campanile, in San Marco, has that same function. To describe a high vantage point, to define the space around it, to make note of a point from afar. Before GPS, I still do, navigate by objects, by the placement of objects, landmarks, what Kevin Lynch called wayfinding. I find it sad that we're almost as if these strong features are becoming invisible in this new realm. Vertical lines, expressive lines, internal framing on that space. I showed in the previous lecture on the Pantheon, what skyscrapers had become in the United States from the creation of tempered steel, two things, tempered steel and elevators. I lived basically a block away from the first building with an elevator in it, I think maybe in the world, the Howat building on Broome Street and Broadway, a place where Mary Todd Lincoln used to shop. Cast iron elevators transformed our notion of height and so forth. Elevators for today, high-speed elevators use cable and electric motors. Hydraulics were simpler. First to use structural steel for an entire frame. Cast iron was that material, wrought iron. It happened on the front of the building, so they put ornaments on it, usually Venetian ornaments. It's relatively soft, contains usually less than 0.1 carbon, and this is how we responded a design item to making skyscrapers. That happened in Chicago to a large extent. Some of the buildings there after the fire were allowed to build upward. And so it was like the car, it's two or three things. It maximized the center urban space. So it did have a use, but again, the kind of negative or dark or just opaque and subconscious response is that these buildings represented egos. The egos of the builders, the architects, the people who financed them, the idea of people living in them, working in them. I was there that day, 9/11, the people dying in them. So we have, yes, they're a sense of utility, but now all the tiny pencil-thin skyscrapers for residents in Central Park South has sort of bloomed up around that region. The going rate for just a simple cube in one of those buildings was $40 million. So, so we see the use of these structures as Frank Lloyd Wright was Louis Sullivan's student. He moved on. The White City built for the World's Fair in Chicago, largely a stage set, all plaster and metal, which would be deconstructed after the World's Fair. Each architect was looking for a new way to express American architecture. We had the curtain wall, where the walls itself did not need to support, I think it's 6 or 7, 8 stories is the compressive strength of brick. So you only can get that far. So they would put an interior skeleton and perhaps have the exterior walls support the buildings with extra strength steel. Yes, and this is more of the use of the curtain wall idea. Flatiron Building in New York, and we see reinforced concrete in these structures. The Woolworth Building, 1913. And then we saw a turn in the Bauhaus toward so-called honesty of style, showing the utility of each structure. Le Corbusier also had that sensibility about it, but achieving this tower in the park, which also has its resonance. So, what does this have to do with designers? Designers making designers absorbing what's out there. Let's just use the word sacred space. What you can put into your work, how you can discern kind of good from kitschy. Here's a modernist building by Philip Johnson in the middle of Minneapolis, IDS Center, but here's Philip Johnson and his postmodern period putting a Chippendale top on that building just as an iconographic element to make it look like a grandfather clock. But fortunately, a lot of those semiotic exercises left in postmodern architecture. What is the postmodern? What was the postmodern? This is the Caesar Pelli Petronas Towers. I've been inside these in Malaysia. Two very tall towers. What does it mean to have two towers instead of one? The Taipei Tower was supposedly the tallest for a while. Rem Koolhaas designed the CCTV headquarters, again with his unlocating deconstructing the sacred, deconstructing the expected, finding some other sort of refinement, some other forms of agendas in the work. This again is to help you establish a sensibility about what you see, what you perceive in cities. If cities are where 70% of the population are, what is really going on here? This is a favorite Frank Gehry building of mine. This is Spruce Street Tower in Lower Manhattan. It looks beautiful in the morning sun when the sun hits it that way. Burj Khalifa. I've been on the outside of this in the hot Dubai sun, and as you can see back there, there's nothing but desert. Again, ego. I keep coming up with many of these lectures, discussion of creative destruction, or potlatch, as the Quadakal Indians used to call it. The idea of burning your wealth in front of your society is an important feature of both the middle-class car and the tower for the wealthy. What will destroy you in its building? So Burj Khalifa outdistance most of them. Willis Tower, which was the old Sears Tower. Sears went away. One World Trade Center, those of course went away. And Empire State, Chrysler, Woolworth, Singer Building, all of these things here have remained. Interesting for that. Interesting, just the algorithms that went into designing the Burj Khalifa. Here's the Gherkin, London, 2004, a highly controversial Norman Foster. So what I want you guys to do is look at the obvious things in your city. Here's the Oculus in Santiago Calatrava, famous for the Oculus, downtown New York. The neo-futuristic curved spaces, parametric design. Here we talked about the TWA Tower, Zaha Hadid we talked about in this. But what are these things doing? How much are they reflecting an ego? And what is this, the building that turns? There's one of these skyscrapers that turns into the sun. So these are fantastic designs that start with concepts, start kind of with utility, but the engineer's job is to know one thing really well, whereas the architect designer's realm is to understand many, many things about the relationship of people to objects. So the designer must become a sociologist, must become a psychiatrist, must become all of these things to play and to conjure and to work with engineers on what would resonate as a object that's sacred. This is a Frank Lloyd Wright Tower, Bartlesville, Oklahoma. these are I was about to say the Getty Museum. The Guggenheim Museum is another object of the feminine, the eternal feminine in the Jungian sense. Here is the emergence of Mies van der Rohe in Park Avenue in New York. In Kyoto, no buildings are allowed taller than 60 meters to protect the overall quality of the historical city. I've been there once. It's a gorgeous place. The 3,000 temples around here, so delicious to be biked to and through and around. And then, to follow the historical context of the city, the idea of the parks and the rain and just the incredible settings. And back to Frank Lloyd Wright, who designed the Falling Water in Pennsylvania, a house that echoes the stratifying of the natural environment set into the hill. As young designers, I want you to be aware of the artifacts that are out there already. What is good design? What's kitsch design? What holds up? What doesn't hold up? And so forth. Austin, been there once too. Not very impressed. And that is it for today's lecture. I froze here for a while. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.